Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. And I have the very sincere honor of leading us off today, and I am Barney, and I am joined with my co-host, and he is
Jacob.
And today, if I had to check on our little podcast hosting website, and we are a day past one whole year since we posted our first episode. So I guess we're technically maybe a year and a week since our since we started off on this journey. And it's been such a fun time for me. It's been such really I feel like from what we thought the podcast might be when we were even talking about considering the idea of doing one to what it has become. It's been such a fun and interesting journey. I think it's one of those things, kind of like when maybe an analogy would be, you see your kids every day, and then so you don't really notice them changing, but someone comes and hasn't seen them for a while, and they say, "Wow, your kids have really grown." I kind of feel like maybe that's what the podcast has been. Jacob and I see it every week, and we're a part of it, and we're doing it. And then I think when we take a minute and look back at the first few episodes, and now we think, wow, the podcast has really grown, and wow, we have really grown too, I think. I am a huge fan of doing reflection episodes, mostly because I'm the person who always thinks of what he really wanted to say after things are done. And so that was one of my motivations for having a kind of reflection episode today, to kind of maybe tease out a little bit more some things that we talked about, maybe some ideas that came to both of us later on, and then also maybe expand it and just kind of reflect on the podcast as a whole instead of on specific issues, specific parts, pieces of or episodes that we've had along the way, even though there really have been a lot of highlights, I think. I know I'll put you on the spot, Jacob. Is there one highlight that sticks out to you when you think about this whole past 40 some episodes we've had together?
Oh, for sure. I really thought the episode with John Roth was very special and unique. He had been your professor, but he also has such a breadth of experience in this whole area of intercultural ministry and hospitality. And so since that's such a focus of our podcast, having him on as a guest was truly a treat, a real treat. And there's so many other guests that brought unique insights that I was grateful for. But when you ask the question, that's at the very top of the list, the first one that jumps out to me. And I just want to piggyback on what you said earlier and say that the podcast has changed and developed, and I'm grateful for that, because that dynamic aspect of not knowing what will emerge from it has also, I think, surprised me, delighted me, and helped me grow and stretch. And so I'm glad we're going to talk about that today. Before we started recording, we were reflecting on how we've done 40. This will be our 44th episode. So out of 52 weeks of the year, to have recorded 44 of those weeks feels like it was a satisfying achievement. So I'm grateful that we've been able to do that. And I can also say, in addition to that, it was just a satisfying thing to do. I enjoyed each time. I looked forward to it each week. And it was also neat this year to, in the mix of all the things we were doing, the two of us, to bring Ken on as another co-host with our special Northern Exposure episodes when they cycle around every so many episodes. That was also very special. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to jumping in and talking about some of the questions that you prepared and some additional thoughts. So where would you like to start in terms of our reflection?
Yeah, I had a thought came to mind while you were talking, and it slipped away from me just a minute. But yeah,
No
Well,
problem.
yeah, I don't know. I can't get. I think maybe for me, maybe just thinking back to the beginning, um, maybe before we look a little bit more specifically, I know that I had I had so much fun doing podcasting with Sean, and I wanted to do something more serious though, and I know that we had a few ideas that we bounced around, and I really didn't guess where this podcast would go, and what I wanted to talk about was the fact that we'd done 44 episodes. And it really is something that I really look forward to every week as well. And I know that when we just started out, we had the Google Doc going with ideas that we brainstormed. And I think we had 10. And I thought, well, I guess 10 episodes is okay. I really never guessed that that we would be so diligent, and we wouldn't have a time where we're like, I don't have any good ideas this week, do you? And you're like, no, I don't either, should we just skip it? The reason why we didn't do 52 or even 53 or 54 is just because of our schedules, not because we didn't have things to talk about. And I like how we've always had, so interesting guests or something interesting to talk about, some interesting way to look at things, bringing together these this two world idea. And it surprises me. I think it surprises both of us the way that some of our episodes go. Sometimes we go in there not with just a really brief, really light outline of what things might turn into, and just end up really satisfied at the end of the episode. I think at least I do.
I agree with that 100%. And I think the element of surprise was crucial in a few episodes where we just went with something that was last minute and it ended up being really enjoyable. I'm thinking of the episode where you got out your ukulele. Was it a ukulele? Is
Yeah,
that?
right.
And
Mm-hmm.
we tried to work on the intro music,
Yeah.
transposing it to a ukulele, and that was a fun episode. And another one I was thinking of is during Holy Week when we just decided we'd jump in
Mm-hmm.
and read the Hebrew text of the Psalm that Jesus quotes when he's on the cross. And just
Mm-hmm.
that was very spontaneous, but it was, I think, ended up being very rich. So those times when we have been willing to venture into the unknown at a kind of late point in the game actually ended up
Mm-hmm.
being a really good thing. And I agree 100% that when we started, it was unclear how many episodes we would try to record or um, how long we would
Mm-hmm.
keep working at it, but it just seemed natural each week to keep trying for the next week.
Yeah.
And I looked at our list last night of ideas, and there's still quite a few that we haven't
Mm-hmm.
gotten to that
Mm-hmm.
we originally had. So it's nice to know that there are things that we'd still like to explore more things that we've planned. But then since we've just named this other reality of the surprises to say, and there's lots of things that we haven't planned to look forward to too. So yeah, definitely. Um, One thing that I wanted to share too, is since we're talking about the early period, is the philosophy of editing and trying to prepare the podcasts. When we first started, it was an audio only podcast, and so I remember thinking, I'm going to go through this file and judiciously edit out any example of an or an and try to tighten it up. I would delete the sound gaps if there was a pause that was too long, and I would spend hours doing that. And I did that probably for maybe 3 or 4 episodes, and then after a while, I thought, is this overkill? Is this really necessary? Because the ethos or the spirit of our podcast is very extemporaneous and it's conversational. So does it really need to be so thoroughly edited? And then right around that time, we started experimenting with the idea of posting the video of our podcast on YouTube. And I was so glad when you um, said, "Yeah, let's try it." And you were just very open, and because the idea interested me, and so once we did it, then it just seemed like natural to not try to edit the audio so much so it would just match the video. because you can't go and edit the video that thoroughly. So and I'm grateful for that change happened, that I loosened up a little bit. And I think maybe if we can take it this way, the mindset I had about editing was also a deeper mindset I had about presentation, and wanting, thinking at the beginning, I wanted to maybe not be more formal, but I guess I'd want to say really infusing a lot of structure and intentionality or planning into the podcast. But then as we got into it more, I felt much freer to let things emerge and to share that with our listeners and our viewers. Like, so I just, that was reflected then in the editing changing. So
Yeah, I like what you say about that. How it gives like kind of an honest feel to it, and like a kind of in Japanese we would say nama, something kind of like pure or fresh or something like that. Um, I personally, for me, it's kind of the editing was kind of a double edged sword. So I enjoyed using the program, and I enjoyed the editing and like learning the tricks of the audio software, and like seeing the neat things that we could do to kind of like cinch things together and make it sound nice. And I know that you kind of I don't know if the word is espoused, but you kind of mentioned the one podcast that the two your two pastor colleagues were doing around the time of the Mennonite conference or the Ohio conference.
yes, the Ohio
And
Conference cast.
right.
Yes,
And so I
yes,
thought, oh boy, this is kind of a lot of pressure.
yes.
We've got to live up. It sounds like they've got a really good reputation. And if we don't come up with something really good that really fits well together and flows well together, we're just not going to get anyone to listen to us. And so I enjoyed that too. And I took some time when I was on the train. I had my headphones, and I would press the pause space bar for pause, and like take some gaps out, take some ums out, and then we would send the file back and forth, put it together. Um, and that was good, and I think that was nice too. But in the end, of course, for our own personal lives and getting other things done, it freed up a lot of time. And I think that I like the freshness and the kind of the earnestness of having it the way it is too.
Well said. Well said. Uh, One thing too that I'd like to highlight is in doing a podcast with you, um, I think it helped me practice the art of conversation, and particularly active listening, following a thread in a conversation, and asking follow up questions. I think in a lot of daily life, I don't want to use too broad of brushstrokes, but I think that in our typical conversations, we don't necessarily follow a thread very far. And we're not always actively listening as thoroughly or as deeply as we could when people are sharing about the details of their life, or a book that they've read, or a show they've seen. And in the podcasting space, kind of having this mindset of, oh, I really want to hang on every word and reflect and see what connections emerge. It's kind of a little bit of a discipline to work at that. But then as you do it over time, maybe your capacity for that grows. It becomes more natural. And so I found myself outside of our podcasts, when I'm talking to people, more engaged and following threads more in the conversation. And I don't know, I feel like in a way, podcasting with you has helped me grow in that area of listening and active conversation, being intentional, and that's been really meaningful. And so I guess for me, podcasting, if I had to describe it to somebody now, it's really about mutuality, and it's about the dialogue and the give and take in the conversation, um, almost as much as it is about the content. Like, you could have great content, but if it's just a series of people monologuing, and they're not, building off of each other, or in that dynamic exchange of ideas, then it's missing something, I think. So I kind of wondered, is there anything, I know you've been doing this longer than me, but is there anything that you learned from this past year through the podcasting that we've done in that regard?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I really have to agree with being active in listening as such a huge thing to pick up. And I think I noticed, especially in the episodes where the guest is someone that I have kind of a stronger relationship with. I'm thinking of like Katrina or my dad or John Roth. And I wonder if maybe if it's maybe just me, or maybe I'm feeling like such a close connection to that person. It's kind of hard for me to separate. But I know, especially in those episodes, you just really astounded me with some of the questions that like really got to the heart of what was at the matter there, of what we were talking about, and like really dug so deep into what we were talking about in such an interesting way. And I maybe I was a little, maybe I felt a little jealous because I thought, wow, that's such a great question. Why can't I come up with such great questions? But yeah, I'm really so thankful about that. And yeah, doing this has really helped me as well to be a better listener with the people around me, and really focus on what people are saying and listening and asking kind of, asking those questions that like you can tell that the person wants you to ask them, or hoping that you will ask them, that to really show that you're interested and show that you're following along and listening. um, Other things that maybe I've learned along the way is exactly, kind of like not necessarily things that we take for granted, but seeing a lot of deeper meaning in the things around us. Like the episode we talked about bread, and where we've thought about talking about neighbors. Um, we've talked about some really kind of specifically interesting topics as well, like, personality tests and things like that. Those are really interesting. And the guests that we've had have
Gardening and
always, yeah, right. Yeah. Have always been interesting. Gardening for sure. Like just these everyday
mothers.
things. Yeah, right. I really appreciated that. And I wonder if um, maybe kind of going back to the highlights, of course, like the John Roth was the first highlight that came to my mind with the episode with John Roth. But I think the gardening one was also so neat.
Mm,
And I think that was because we took just this topic that, it spans basically every culture. Wherever there's things that you can grow, people can relate to this. And I thought we really dug into it and saw it and connected it with a lot of other interesting aspects of life too.
yes, and I, I appreciate what you're saying. It's maybe, to rephrase it, it's like a mindfulness about life in general. How, like you said, the things surrounding us, and trying to have a posture of appreciation and gratitude for them, and noticing them more. That's a really good insight. And as you're talking about it, maybe, well, first off, thank you for your kind words. You had some nice words of affirmation in there about, um, working with me. Um, and I just want to say there was one episode that stands out to me when I really appreciated something about you, specifically, and how you listen. It was the episode we did about my high school, Wheeling Central Catholic High School, and um, the thoughtfulness of your questions during that episode, and how you connect to them with your own experience. Like, you were able to hear me and hear what I was saying, and then you could connect with what you experienced at Marquette. You were able to connect what you experienced when you were abroad, and that's a really good thing to build a bridge, and listen in a way that draws the other person's story out, uh, while also showing empathy and like connection with your own story. So, but that is another episode too, where we're talking about something ordinary. Like, most people have quite a few stories from high school that they could probably share. But just talking about that, it felt like it was done in a way that really, I could voice my gratitude and appreciate it. And you entered right in to the experience. So I had a few people later, one person in particular, mention that episode. And it was a surprise to me because it's not one of the ones that was with a guest or had a lot of planning ahead of time. But it was one I think that was really authentic and from the heart. So, yeah. Well, we were talking there just a minute ago about the episode related to gardening. And one of
Hmm.
the questions that you had drafted ahead of time related
Hmm.
to the scripture passage that we looked at
Hmm.
during that episode from
Yeah.
Jeremiah.
Mm.
Do you want to ask the question, and then I could respond a little bit too? And
Y- yeah, sure. Yeah. So, and then also kind of for some context, going back to when we looked at the Psalms together with that just fascinating scripture and analysis program that you have, it really opened up the Bible to me. Just and I thought, wow, what an amazing tool to be able to have access to. And I remember listening to you read the scripture from Jeremiah, and of course your inspiration. I think part of your inspiration for it was the fact that Jeremiah is talking about telling the Israelites to do the ordinary things. You will be in exile, or you are in exile, but don't dwell on it. It's part of where you are now, and plant gardens, and kind of pray for the blessings, the prosperity of the city where you are. And and then at the very end, I don't know if it's the English teacher in me or what, I it that one word just really struck me, because here they're talking about, we know the context, we know the story. you know um Josiah before exile was really fervent. He realized what had happened, and he was really trying to make things amends. And then from his kids and his grandkids, they didn't follow his path, and Jeremiah really tried to get them back on the right path. And then, Judah ended up in exile. That was the best that they had for them, and probably in a really awful way that it took place for them. Really, it must have been, think of the suffering. Um, and then amidst all this, there's this word, this verb, where God says that He carried them into exile. And to think, as unhappy and upset and frustrated as God was with His people, to use the word carry, because we have, I mean, for me, obviously, I know, right? Not obviously, but for me, right away, the first thought is carrying a child. And to think of God punishing Judah, but carrying them into exile. And so I just wondered, is it a translation that renders it into English as carry, as this kind of gentle father, parently thing? Or is it just something that, is that a direct translation? Is it something kind of contextual? So I'm just really curious. I just really wanted to follow up on that and learn
ah,
more about that word.
that's a great question. And I looked up information about it in this really helpful resource called the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. It's a multi-volume work looking at the different prominent Hebrew words from the Old Testament text, and particularly how the words are used in a theological sense in the various portions of the book, like the Torah, or the historical writings, or the prophetic literature, or the wisdom literature, and it kind of goes through in a systematic way and looks at word usage in that way. It's a really great resource. And so I looked up this word, and in Hebrew it is galah, 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 and it is not quite um, a sense of carrying in a very nurturing, careful way that we might think. At least from what I was reading, there's a lot of senses to the word, but when it's used in the prophetic literature, like we find in Jeremiah and Isaiah and Amos, it's connected really with the theme of judgment. And it can mean to lead off into exile, to carry off into exile. So there is a sense in which it results from the moral failing of the people. And so I didn't get a sense from reading about it that it necessarily had as much of a nurturing aspect, although maybe the translator used the word carry instead of lead or drive off because of the context of the immediate passage, where in Jeremiah, you know, he's comforting the people and saying, plant gardens where you are. And it's kind of hopeful. And he's speaking
Mm-hmm.
about like the promise of God, like God will be with you in this place. And so maybe in that context of comfort, maybe that's why the translator
Mm-hmm.
seemed to frame it in a more positive sense. But just to give you a few other interesting connectors, in the Old Testament, at one point, the Ark of the Covenant is captured by one of Israel's foreign neighbors, and um, one of the people are distraught, and they're lamenting this because the ark is like the visible focal point and reminder of God's presence with them, right? The tablets of the Ten Commandments were in the ark, and the manna from the desert, and it's carried around, and it's just a sign of God's presence. So they're lamenting this, and one of the people in the story says that God's glory has been carried off as the ark has been taken away. This idea of this word gala, um, is it's not like a warm and fuzzy. It's traumatic. Like it's carried off in a way
Mm-hmm.
that God's glory has been carried off. It's like we feel a separation, and then um, it's also in the historic books, like in the books of the Kings, it talks about exile and and people lamenting that they've been carried off, and we see it in the prophetic literature too, like people sorrowful and singing songs of lament that they've been carried off in exile. So, and one final example is in the book of Job. Uh, there's a story of this person's house being carried away, and the phrase is that it's carried, I mean, like by a storm and
Yeah.
violent weather,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
it carried away in judgment. So
Ah.
so just to give you a sense of a gala, it's in the usage here, it's most likely more I carried you off into exile is more like this was a expression of punishment, but now that you're
Mm-hmm.
there, I haven't forgotten you. I mean, if we're imagining God speaking to the people, and I will be
Mm-hmm.
with you,
Mm-hmm.
and then ultimately I will bring you back.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so a little journey into the word
Mm-hmm.
there,
Mm-hmm.
Gala.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and if for listeners, that software program that you had mentioned is called Logos Bible Software. It's
Oh,
a really
right. Yeah.
nice program. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's always so interesting. Again, kind of reflecting on the episodes that we had about different versions of the Bible, how reading different versions kind of the translator takes maybe these words that could be rendered differently, and we see passages new and fresh sometimes when we look at them, depending on the different version that we're reading.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that's a great example of one that you just that you gave. You know how
Mm-hmm.
in the English it looks. We could get the
Mm-hmm.
impression that it is
Mm-hmm.
to carry has this nurturing, more of a positive association.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I was in seminary. I don't know if I've shared this already, but one of my professors would give this example frequently of in Greek, the word to worship is proskune, which means to kiss towards, is one translation. But he was in a worship service once, and the minister who was giving the message was talking about is this intimate sign of expression of kissing towards God. And isn't that inspiring? We send these kisses towards God.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And he was kind of shocked because if you look at the historical context, it's more in the sense of like the sovereign is walking by and people are like bent over on the ground and kissing towards their feet. It's not a sign of like intimacy like we think of kissing towards somebody in that sense, but it's an expression of humbling oneself and kissing towards the feet of one who is being honored. So that's an example of like in English where something's lost. So uh,
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's easy to see how no matter how many times you've read something, if you don't if you are unable or haven't had the chance to really dig into something further, you might um, read something and interpret it one way, and and then on the other hand, even if your interpretation is right or not right, you can still kind of extrapolate meaning that is dear to you from that one part. Maybe thinking of the Jeremiah scripture, in Old Testament context, it really makes sense that being carried off or led off or sent off into exile is more accurate to the meaning at that time. But then if we think about it in terms of grace and maybe with Jesus then coming and everything that changed in the New Testament, we could even kind of think of it in a way as now facing our hardships, facing our senses of exile, that we really are, yoked together. That scripture that you love so well from the Message,
Yes.
and we can then kind of maybe legitimately kind of interject that nurturing sense into the hard times that we're going through, knowing that for sure, maybe we're going through hard times, but someone is here with us carrying
Yes.
us along.
That's a really good point, Barney. Yes. In the New Testament context, there's a sense in which Jesus enters into the suffering, enters in a very personal way. The suffering that he endured for us, like so many years ago, the suffering of the cross, but then also the sense that Jesus is present in our current day suffering and how there's something redemptive at work in that. And that does shift or change how we view hardship. I agree. That's a really good point. Yeah. Um, were there some other questions that you wanted to delve into from previous episodes?
Yeah, I think that maybe kind of a nice segue from what we've been talking about, kind of going back to the episode with John Roth, and like kind of the first question that I proposed, I wasn't quite sure how to approach that. I was so nervous in that episode because it was, such a coup to be able to have him there. And I wanted to start off with like kind of real cool question, that was real thought provoking. And then I'm glad that he took it on in the direction that he did, thinking about scholarship and faith, because um, here in our context here, looking at the word scholarly really is a way to build our faith and strengthen our faith. But in general, the idea of scholarship usually is kind of seeking fact, things that you can prove. And I in the John Roth episode, I kind of touched on it, and then he kind of touched on it. But I'm curious if if you had any kind of experience with maybe through your scholarship, if you found some things or looked at some things in a way, and that really kind of dawned on you, and you're like something like really dawned on you, and like kind of impacted or increased your faith in a way through that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a few thoughts come to mind. One is on my graduation day from my doctoral program, my dad met my doctoral advisor. There was a little reception afterward. And I don't know if I've told you this story before, but when he met my doctoral advisor, whose name is Amos Young, um, he said to Dr. Young, one thing that I've always loved about my son Jacob is that he loves God from here. And he pointed to my heart. And without missing a beat, like just right off immediately in response, Dr. Young said, and he loves God from here. And he pointed to my head just in a moment's notice, like that was his response. And I appreciated that about him as an advisor, because he didn't look in a binary way at intellect and emotion or scholarship and experience as separate things, but he saw that there was an organic connection between both, and creativity and emotion and play and exploration, I think, in the way he does his own scholarship, play a role and actually help him to have deeper insights and energy and vitality as he's working and researching. And so he modeled that for me. And that was really good because as you know, instead of going into academia, um,
Mm.
I received a call in ministry at Worcester Mennonite. And so right away, the academic way of writing and expressing ideas I needed to be altered or shifted when I was moving to a ministry context. And so I had to think, how do I take like the essence of what I've learned or the value of that approach to asking questions into a different context? And I felt like very much that it has enriched uh, ministry. And so I think what scholarship is for me is like a longer, deeper, more intentional look at a topic, whatever it is. You could plug in the discipline, and it's intentionally trying to consider it carefully and go deep with that information. And so, in terms of like life experience, I think if you take a longer, deeper look, as we've done with just basic things around us, that is kind of the impulse of the scholar, is
Mm.
to uh, philosophically maybe
Mm.
consider the nature of things, to appreciate, understand what they are. And so um, that is kind of the heart behind scholarship. And then from a Christian point of view, there is a sense of awe and wonder surrounding what we can know and what we can't know, and a sense of God as a source of knowledge. And so I think, like we read in the one Psalm, that
Mm.
is, be still and know that I am God. The word for be still in the Greek version of the Old Testament is skolazo, which is the base of our modern word for scholar. So that
Mhm.
type of stillness is a considered focus and attentiveness to the mystery, of God and the world around us, of creation, and of what we're studying, a sense of mystery and how vast it is. So at least that's how I
Mm.
understand it. So to answer your question, I don't I don't see a chasm between scholarship and regular life. I think it's lamentable when things are presented that way, and when there's kind of an anti-intellectualism, or the reverse, where there's a kind of uh, condescension
Mm.
from an academic point of view towards the um, unenlightened, or however you want
Mm.
to phrase it, of people who don't know as
Mhm.
much about whatever
Mhm.
discipline it is. It's
Mhm.
life is should invite um, deep uh, research and focus on topics, as well as rich experience and ordinary everyday things. So yeah, how about for you? Have you learned some things about the connection between scholarship and experience or ordinary life?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is just right on, and how no matter what you're doing, you have to leave room for exactly like things um, that aren't knowable or aren't explainable or can't be distilled into some formula or this or that. Um, and it kind of makes me think of a story from another Goshen College professor, Steve Nolt. He was reading. He told us this time where he was reading this really scholarly work about that another historian who was Mormon, who was writing about John Smith. And as he's reading the book, he's thinking, how is he going to conclude this? Everything is pointing to like a number of factual problems with this situation here. And what is this author who is a Mormon, how is he going to conclude this? And then he ended up bringing it together through his faith, saying that essentially the person who John Smith was couldn't have come up with this on his own. And so, despite the things that he had listed, the arguments that he made, the things that he'd uncovered throughout the progress of the book, it was his faith that kind of was able to tie in and kind of tie up everything, and still kind of not necessarily um, give credence to what it is that he believed. And
Hmm.
I was really interested to hear that was kind of the conclusion, and the conclusion is an acceptable one. When you read it in that way, you're not thinking, oh, he's just kind of uh, he's just trying to convince himself. what he wrote, what he said, how he concluded it really made sense. And I like that I think that what you said also is really true, that there's a lot of times where, and especially in scholarship, and I ran into this myself, um, where things that can't be proven, things that can't be designed into an experiment, things that don't match up with the kind of scientific method, aren't worth being explored, or aren't valid. And I don't think that's so. And I think that scholarship, working in conjunction, God taught us how to be scholars, working in conjunction with faith, really has so much more to it. I think that when we see that, and we know it when we see it presented in such a way.
Oh, that's so interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking about how in academia, sometimes you see a willingness to dialogue in a way that both parties recognize the maybe underlying logic of the other's argument. And even though they may not adopt the position of the other person, they can still suspend judgment enough to consider the logic or what's being presented by the other, even if at the end of the day they say that's not where I land. And I appreciate that when you do see it really operating in a healthy way. And I think that our society at large doesn't, at least I'm painting with a broad brushstroke here, but let me just say this. Right now in our public discourse in the United States, certain things, certain topics, we just are unable to do that, to dialogue in a way where we're really considering well the argument of the other and seeing the logic in it, even if we don't subscribe to it ourselves. I'm thinking about things related to politics, or certain buzz word or topics that are controversial in areas of science, or other things in public discourse. And I think that's one area where I think the scholarly community has modeled a better way. Not always, but in a lot of ways, in terms of the curiosity to learn and understand another's point of view. And so, yeah, when you mentioned the book about Joseph Smith, yeah, maybe the professor you had doesn't agree with the conclusion of that author, but he can see how that person came to hold the position that they have, and he can appreciate the logic in that, even if he doesn't land there himself. And that is a very important human skill, like for healthy, flourishing in relationship with other people. And as we're talking earlier about being good listeners, and wanting to do that in life, I think that's a skill we all need to think about and see how can we do that too. So good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I'm trying to remember, was there yet another one that you had, or was that the final?
Kind of just the last thing that came to my mind reflecting on the year was the idea of music in general. We haven't had an episode that we've talked about music yet, and I'm sure that maybe that'll be in year number 2. But yeah, you mentioned the ukulele episode, and before we started that, I was just playing, practicing with ukulele and seeing how fulfilling and nourishing it feels. And then also there was the episode where we were talking about Zelda with Lena.
Oh, yes.
And we talked about how satisfying the music can be to different video games, and maybe people don't right away associate great or moving or inspiring music with video games, but probably we all, a lot of people probably, if they think about it, realize that maybe some of the experience that they had while playing the game, and then that music is kind of the soundtrack to the game, really kind of stuck with them, and they were able to find a new appreciation for the video game experience through that. And that was just something that I really appreciated about that. And it's nice that you and I both have the appreciation for music and different types of music, and also for video games too. And And it was neat to hear a lot of people have talked about how much they liked the video game episode that we did too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is fascinating, and I agree. I've had a number of people talk with me about it, and I think maybe one of the things that is refreshing is that um, maybe for people who don't play video games, they assume that video games are more just a distraction or something you do in your youth, or something that maybe is relegated just solely to the realm of like junk food entertainment type of thing, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, with not much substance. And I guess maybe what we were trying to say is that video games, um, at their best, can also be expressions of art and story, and have beautiful music that elevates the experience, and it can be another vehicle for entering into another world, and kind of just like we would think of with a movie, or in some cases even a book, depending on the video game. Some reach quite an interesting level of detail in the stories. So um, with the Legend of Zelda, it has such a lore, it's such a mythos, that it's like a perfect example of this. It's got all these layers: story, complexity, beautiful music, beautiful visual artistry, and not only the pixel art or the graphics, but just in the art design, and how people have created the characters. And so I think just appreciating the art and the other pieces of the games came out as we passionately were talking, and
Yeah.
maybe our audience could say, oh yeah, like maybe there's more to some video games than not just an escapist thing, or just not just like a junk
Mm-hmm.
food thing, but it can also be a valid or interesting expression of art and story.
Mm-hmm.
But I like too that during this episodes, um, when we talked about video games, a lot of times too, we talked about our personal stories. Like Lena could talk about, um, the first Zelda game she played, and
Yeah.
and her dad being interested in it, and how they were all committed to play through it without consulting any guides, and how there was like this connection to her past and her childhood. And I guess you could plug in anything. It wouldn't have to be video games. It could be like listening to records, or it could be throwing a baseball with your
Mm-hmm.
parent. But whatever that is, it's a vehicle for memory and connection, and it's something to enjoy. So I think that function is what it had for her, and then for us too, that as we talk about these games, we can think of where we were when we played them, and it's just another way to savor the experiences, to think about those connections. So yeah, but how about for you, when you think of those episodes, are there any other things that jump out to you?
Yeah. I just really enjoy listening to our episodes as well. And I like that I can use the kind of smart speaker that we have here at the house, and I can just ask it to play the Two World podcast, and it chimes in and it plays the episode. And I remember listening a few times. Just I think maybe the website it was linking to wasn't updating right away, so I heard the Orville the Monday Meals episode a few times. Actually, I really appreciated that episode.
Yes.
I really liked how the whole thing came to be, and just the flow of the episode. And I thought that had a lot of good questions, and that our guest that day, that he kind of you could kind of sense that he was seeing things in a different, kind of in a new way through our questions and our interest in their project too. And
Yes.
I really enjoyed. I
That was
really
a
enjoyed
great
that episode.
episode. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
and his name is Bill Seymour, and
Oh
he's
yeah.
one of, we had mentioned earlier, the Ohio Conference
Yeah.
Cast. He's one of the hosts of that podcast, and so having him on as a guest was a real treat, not only for what he had to share, but he also is very comfortable with the podcasting format, and he could, it was playful and engaging in how he would jump into the questions and interact with us. So one of the other hosts from that podcast too, Thomas Dunn, was a guest for us, and we were able to interview him about the Akron Swahili Community Church, and
Mhm.
that was another case where he has podcasting experience, and that enhanced it. And I'm glad that you mentioned enjoying listening to the podcast. I do too. Oftentimes when I'm driving or at the store, I'll put it on, and I listen mostly through Apple Podcasts, and it's just real easy. I
Mhm.
have it queued up, and I can just
Mhm.
start it. And if I'm in the vehicle, it links through Bluetooth to my van speakers, and or if I'm in the store, I just put my headphones in, and it's a really neat way to appreciate what we've done. When you're in the midst of it, recording it,
Mhm.
there are things that maybe I'll speak for myself. There are things that I miss, and then when I go back and listen to it, I'm like, oh, I didn't catch that, or I didn't realize the nuance in that comment, and so um, that's really enjoyable to. And I just thought of one more thing, if I may, since we were talking about music earlier. Um, the theme song for opening and closing comes from a song that I had written when I was in college called I Believe. And I had written it in a period of time where I was very discouraged. I went through this slump my sophomore year where I was taking a lot of difficult courses, and I felt like weighed down and a little bit disconnected from my friends on campus because I was just spending a lot more time working on these courses. And um, I was really questioning even if I should be at college at that season. I remember calling my parents and being like, maybe I should withdraw and just take some time to do some ministry, get some ministry experience with mission or something, and then come back. But anyway, I wrote this song, I Believe. And it's kind of like a little bit in the spirit of the Psalms. It starts out with a lot of lament, and then it has a chorus affirming belief, kind of like in the Psalms. There's this normally an affirmation of belief. And then the part of our podcast that plays every week is this aspirational response, just with music in my mind, what is a sense of transcendence of God hearing the cry, and the affirmation of belief is then affirmed by the sense of God's presence. And so um, the way I wrote the notes, bum bum bum, they go from low to high, bum bum bum, and it's meant to symbolize the aspiration of the word, the request going upward just as the notes move upward. And so just to give you a little context for when I wrote it, that was the spirit behind it. And so it's kind of interesting to think of that being played in our podcast each week as a sense of maybe we aspire and hope and look toward these moments in life when God lifts us. And if things are heavy, or if we have a sense we don't have an answer for something, or we're looking around, that there can be these moments where we're drawn upward. So just thought I'd share that about that song. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, what a blessing to have that connected with what we're doing. And yeah, it really, I think, maybe going all the way back to the beginning, you know, my personal motivation for this podcast was to really kind of inject and explore faith and my faith, and in faith as it is in the life around me, and look into that. And then having you to be the co-host, with you know, not that you can be more qualified, but you as a pastor have a much different insight, and really shed light in a lot of different ways that I couldn't myself. And I'm glad and I'm thankful for that, and thankful for this podcast, and what a wonderful way to kind of put that seal of affirmation on it, to have the amazing song that you wrote at the beginning and the end of each episode too, and what it means.
Thank you, Barney. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I feel the same way. I too wanted to grow in my faith and um, grow in our friendship, which I feel has also been
Mm-hmm.
another enjoyable part of this journey. Our listeners don't necessarily know this, but after we record, it's quite frequent for us to keep talking after the episode and share and pray together. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's been a wonderful part of this journey. I'm very grateful. So thank you for that.
Hmm.
Is there anything else that you would like to mention before we close our time?
Oh, we could go on and on, but yeah, yeah.
um,
We'll
yeah.
save it for next year.
Okay, that sounds good. To be continued.
Yeah.
As I close, I just want to think about the image of the two worlds coming together. And this past week, I was looking at a prayer by a person named Ted Loder. And he talked in the prayer about how God brings us to the edge of what is possible and helps us look on to what is new on the horizon. And I think, sometimes we're in our world, to use this metaphor, the Two World Podcast, and um, we don't think of the other world, the experience of the other, until we have moments where we can come to the edge of our world. And I mean, using this metaphor, and glimpse a little bit at theirs, um, and with God's help, see something new. And so, I guess my prayer as we close, and my hope is for our listeners and for you and for me, that we continue to experience moments like that where we're brought to the edge of our world and we can see out and, with God's help, into something new and experience something good that we hadn't seen before, and that through the other person we encounter, too, that we can also be open and show hospitality and recognize God at work in those experiences, and also have gratitude for the gift of each day, just as I'm grateful for this year with you, Barney. And I'm grateful for each of our listeners and viewers that you've been with us on this journey. Thank you for taking time to join in with us in our experience. So until our next episode in season 2, year 2 of the Two World Podcasts, have a great rest of the day.